This is John Nichols of The Nation magazine, and you're listening to the Ralph Nader Radio Hour.
Stand up, you've been sitting way too long.
Welcome to the Ralph Nader Radio Hour. My name is Steve Scrovan, along with my co-host David Feldman. Hello, David.
Good morning.
And our producer, Hannah Feldman. Hello, Hannah.
Hello, Steve.
And, of course, the man of the hour, Ralph Nader. Hello to you, too, Ralph.
Hello, everybody, and it's time for the new issue of the Capital Citizen. I really have never seen anything that we've put out in over 55 years that has received such rave reviews and such thorough letters to the editor as to why they like the Capital Citizen, and we hope they turn themselves into powerful Capital Citizens, because it starts with Congress, it rebounds with Congress, no matter who's in charge.
Thanks for that, Ralph. In our continuing coverage of the ever-widening war in the Middle East, we welcome back Nassim Nicholas Taleb. Mr. Taleb is a former derivatives trader who has become a scholar, mathematical researcher, and philosophical essayist. He's going to bring his powers of analysis to the current situation in the Middle East, and specifically how Israel's latest incursions into Lebanon could, in the long run, backfire on Israel. And it's been a little over a week since the presidential election. Donald Trump has wasted no time in naming cabinet appointees. So far, he's tapped South Dakota Governor Kristi Noem for the Department of Homeland Security, where we can safely assume she will not only begin rounding up undocumented immigrants, but also shooting their dogs. He has named Elon Musk and Vivek Ramaswamy head of a brand new agency they're calling the Department of Government Efficiency, which is really the Department of Government Gutting, whose first target will most likely be the National Labor Relations Board. And he's named Fox and Friends weekend host Pete Hegseth as Secretary of Defense. Trump wants this guy to run the Pentagon when he couldn't even make the cut for the primetime Fox and Friends gig. At this rate, look for Brian Kilmeade to be named head of the Joint Chiefs of Staff. To help us understand what we can expect from the incoming administration, we welcome journalist Ryan Grimm, co-founder of Drop Site News, host of the podcast Deconstructed, and co-host of the show Counterpoints. And finally, we welcome back our resident constitutional scholar, Bruce Fein, for a post-election Donald Trump legal roundup. He'll give us his expert analysis on the once and future president's upcoming sentencing in New York, his pending cases in Georgia and the federal courts, and Trump's many other once and future crimes. As always, somewhere in the middle, we'll check in with our irrepressible corporate crime reporter, Russell Mokhiber. But first, to analyze this moment of deep uncertainty and high risk in the Middle East, we turn to our first guest. David?
Nassim Nicholas Taleb spent 21 years as a derivatives trader before changing careers to become a scholar, mathematical researcher, and philosophical essayist. Mr. Taleb's works focus on mathematical, philosophical, and practical problems with risk and probability, as well as on the properties of systems that can handle disorder. He is the author of many essays and books about risk and uncertainty, including the New York Times best-selling The Black Swan and Skin in the Game, Hidden Asymmetries in Daily Life. Welcome back to the Ralph Nader Radio Hour, Nassim Nicholas Taleb.
Thank you very much. I'm extremely honored. And by the way, do you know who it was dedicated to, the last book, Skin in the Game?
Can I guess?
Yes?
Ralph?
Ralph Nader and Ron Paul.
Thank you. Welcome, Nassim. It's a pleasure to have you on. You are the author of the bestseller Black Swan, and you've turned that metaphor into a world-recognized term. But some of our listeners may want to know what Black Swan refers to. Could you just define it briefly?
Yeah, they're events that outside the realm of what you can expect, and that's the first point. But the second one, which is the theme of the book, is that these drive history. So in other words, it's not the ordinary, the accumulation of the ordinary that drives history, but rather exceptional events that you don't see coming. But again, my work, if I were to write my own tombstone, it would be about that I focused on fragility and anti-fragility, fragility of systems, and how systems collapse, which is probably logical extension of the Black Swan, what systems are affected by unexpected, and what systems, can handle it and then even get better from it. All my political ideas, everything is driven by the notion of fragility.
Well, that segues us to the Middle East, where there's a lot of fragility. You're an American citizen, but you were born and grew up in Lebanon. And I think our listeners would like to listen to your views on what's happened, especially since the invasion by the Israeli forces and the bombardment all over Lebanon, civil infrastructure and human beings and emergency medical people all being killed day after day. What's your analysis?
So I was in Lebanon for part of I go to Lebanon every 2 months, and I'm going back in a couple of weeks after Thanksgiving. So I was in Lebanon. Maybe I visited, I landed there in uncertain condition, maybe about 7 times since the event started, more. So I have sort of skin in the game in the sense that I know the perspective from there. And I will tell you that when you read the news, you think that it's a war zone, but effectively, I look at it the other way, is that there's very little destruction compared to destruction is more emotional. So in other words, it doesn't really weaken whatever it's trying to destroy. So the tactical error of Israel was to occupy southern Lebanon, which created Hezbollah. In 2006, they did what they're doing today, and maybe at a smaller scale. And effectively, it multiplied the strength of Hezbollah by 1 order of magnitude. So, and now I think after that, it will strengthen Hezbollah even more, or strengthen the other parties even more. Let's look at things in a long historical prism. That since 1948, every single war or a single confrontation gets more violent. So, in other words, Israel has been more and more violent progressively, culminating with what we're seeing, the horrors we're seeing in Gaza now. And it's not, this is not a modus operandi. In other words, it's not weakening, it's not strengthening their cause. It's giving them maybe short-term strategic advantage, but long-term, it's not working. In other words, the trade, as we say in finance, the trade is not working if you have to keep getting more and more violent. And the second point is that they used to have the support of Britain and then the United States and France. And that is weakening. And even worse, that the power of Western Europe and the United States in terms of GDP in total is declining. So just like in the last 15 years since, or in the 18 years since 2006, since the confrontation between Hezbollah and Israel, the GDP of the United States relative to the rest of the world has gone down by maybe 7 points, and the same for Europe, even more. And China went up from 5% of the world's GDP to about 22% if we look at purchasing power parity. So what I'm saying is that the supporters of Israel are getting smaller in relative economic and financial size, and which, of course, in technological size as well. So it's getting smaller, while at the same time, Israel relies more and more on their support. So that's not a, robust situation. So in other words, the strategy of Israel being confrontational, continuously confrontational, has led to more and more confrontation. And the strategy of relying on the West is not going to pay off.
You think that Netanyahu purposely exaggerated the power of Hamas and Hezbollah and then labeled them existential threats, which is absurdity, in order to further entrench his demands on the United States?
Maybe locally. You see, I don't think in terms of local events, because, of course, Netanyahu has had a long strategy of trying to take the whole thing. So in other words, he doesn't promote ethnic cleansing explicitly, but he does it implicitly. And he has taken advantage of the weakness of the United States with respect to Israel. In other words, they can't say no, to keep increasing settlements when the United States were opposed to them, and continuously drive Israel to be more and more of a discriminatory one race, one people land, when about 50% of the population in what it occupies is not of that faith. So what I'm saying is that that's his strategy. His strategy was explicitly to prevent the two-state solution. He wants the whole thing. But fortunately, he was unable to expel the Gazan people, which is his strategy. He has not been able to do ethnic cleansing fully, and they find themselves in a quagmire. They want the whole thing, but the problem is that they want it without the people on it, and the people on it represent about half the population. So that's the strategy by Netanyahu is eventually going to backfire. The previous strategy by Labor gave hope for peace because a retrenchment into a well-defended, smaller area that's not too contested would have given them a long lease, you see.
What about the daily destruction in Lebanon that seems to
The daily destruction
follow a
in Lebanon.
pattern like Gaza? They're killing doctors, blowing up hospitals, emergency people.
They're doing a lot of bad things in Lebanon, visibly. They're doing a lot of destruction. They're bringing down buildings that have Syrian refugees and no clear military target. They've been following, they have basically, it's like someone who doesn't believe in a false positive. So, in other words, if there's suspicion of weakening Hezbollah, they would kill 10 times as many people as needed or whatever. They don't care. But the weakening long term of whoever they're trying to destroy is not going to happen, because every time they have attacked Hezbollah, and that's since, I'm talking since 1982, since the inception of that movement after the Israeli occupation, Hezbollah got stronger, or that the Shiite movements that preceded Hezbollah, and then Hezbollah got stronger. So I don't think their strategy of destruction is effective. People can rebuild, and you can weaken the military capabilities, and these, they can get weapons back in no time. Especially that their godfather, Iran, the godfather of Hezbollah, has a stronger and stronger alliance with Russia and China. And China is making weapons that are more and more effective and much cheaper than those produced in the West.
Nassim, what about Netanyahu and his clique want to go for the whole ball game and drag the U.S. into an attack on Iran?
You may say bad things about Trump all you want, okay? But it's less likely to happen under Trump than under Biden, the Biden administration, for several reasons. Number one, Trump is stronger. He knows how to put his foot down. And the second thing is he doesn't like wars. So he doesn't like regime change. And although he's naming all these weird neocons and interventionists, he doesn't believe in expanding wars. So I doubt this will happen. Nevertheless, I doubt, this is not Iraq. You're not dealing with Iraq. You're dealing with a very different environment, and it was dealing with forming alliances against the West with the BRICS, and that are economically now much more powerful than the West. So this is not the Cold War. We're talking about a complete different game where the superpowers economically and militarily are progressively in the China area, which is the BRICS. I mean, they built the BRICS for their own zone of influence. So I'm saying that you're not attacking Iran, you're attacking now an alliance. You may be attacking an alliance. And then the other thing is, it's not as easy because the Iranians know what happened in Iraq. And I don't think it's going to be easy to attack them. It's particularly that the Arabs now are getting closer to Iran. The natural allies.
Could you elaborate that? The Saudis and Iran?
Okay, China forced Saudi Arabia to become friends. Okay, make peace, because there was no very explicit word, become friends with Iran, exchange ambassadors. And recently, you've had military cooperation between Iran and Saudi Arabia, or maybe it's not a military cooperation, but they called it a cooperation or a collaboration. So Saudi Arabia, they understand history, and they have the feeling that, you want to be friends with China. So China is making these countries reconcile. And it's not just Saudi Arabia, and it's within the Palestinian factions as well. Instead of divide and conquer, they're uniting and conquering. So that's the complete different Confucian strategy on the part of China. So if I look long run, that Iran not only is getting stronger militarily, but also is getting in a network that is more and more protected, because Saudi Arabia will not let the US or Israel use its airspace or bases to attack Iran. And that's sufficient to make the task difficult. And I have the feeling that the Islamic world is large, 2 billion people. So we're talking about an environment that is gaining in both economic power and technological power. I have a sort of like an essay, not unpublished, quite technical, saying that when you move from 3 standard deviation to 4 standard deviation, you multiply the number of PhDs by something like 40. So if you have an increase in economic power of, 1 standard deviation, which is achieved, in a few years, in under 10 years by a country, then you're multiplying all these technical specialties, the people in these technical specialties by 40. So you can expect that you're going to have more and more Muslim PhDs, people in the technological professions, and you don't want to have a confrontation east-west when you have such a large number of technical people in front of you. So the problem of the United States is that its alliance with Israel is causing it to have confrontation with entities it should be friends with. And the general public understand that.
Let's go to Netanyahu's tactics and strategy here. People say he doesn't have an end game other than to try to clear part of Gaza for the Israeli real estate industry. But his tactics in Lebanon seem to be to try to pit the Christian Lebanese against the Shiite Hezbollah, where they say, look what you've brought onto our country. Is that going to succeed?
Well, it has not worked. But let me tell you that they have been very careful to, outside a few exceptions, hit targets in Christian areas or Sunni areas and they probably have their own, what I call soft power with the Christians, because you find more support among Lebanese Christians in proportion, more support for Israel than you find among Jewish Americans. Just to tell you, as proportion, it is weird. But at the same time, people know in Lebanon that they got to live together. We had a civil war, so we know how to avoid another one. And enough wise people are opposed to it, particularly the Christian, I would say, military, those who could be the military powers. Because it's civil war, you need the warlords to be involved. And these warlords are absolutely against any confrontation. And even though they may have a divergence of interest with Hezbollah, they want to avoid any confrontation. So I don't think that strategy is going to be effective this time. It was effective in the 70s, pitting Christians against Muslims and Christians against Palestinians in the 70s. Today, it's not going to work. Christians in Lebanon are much smaller in number, in proportion, than they were then, and they know it. So they know that to survive as a minority, you want to integrate in your landscape.
That's true. That's been true for decades. The Christian percentage of the population has been declining. But when is Netanyahu going to face a red light in his daily bombardment of Lebanon?
I don't know.
Bibi Biden, Bibi Blinken aren't going to do it. Doesn't look like Trump's nominees are going to do it. What's the end game in Lebanon for Netanyahu?
Okay, I'm not into short-term things, and the environment every day. Netanyahu is in a situation where the whole, it's not just Netanyahu, it's that whole class of Israelis who are really violently, against anything related to the Palestinian state. So I think that long run, what mistakes they made in Gaza is that it doesn't give them a military gain to just level all these buildings and kill all these people. Do what they did with the Shiites in Lebanon. It's not going to give them any military advantage in the long run. But the name of Israel became mud in most countries, except in Western countries that have a sort of like a propaganda presence, like outside the United States, Britain, France, and maybe Germany. I don't think that Israel has a good image. I don't think that it looks like a victim or, its existence due to the fact that it portrayed itself as a victim. I don't think it's going to concern anyone. And then what's worse is that the new generation of people of the Judaic faith are no longer in agreement with the state. And that is the problem, you see, with the activities of the state. So I'm looking at things long term. What I'm saying is I'm not looking at short term, okay? Netanyahu is unable to expel Palestinians because nobody wants them, and is unable to kill them because, you can kill 50,000, but that's not, you have 7 million left, okay? And will be unable long-term to do apartheid. So he doesn't have a basis for a long-lasting state. So even if they annex the West Bank, they won't be able to expel the Palestinians. And in the long run, something like apartheid is against history. So you can't really stand against history. Let me give you one other piece of information that more and more are realizing that the descendants of the ancient Hebrews are the Palestinians, particularly Palestinian Christians. So people are realizing that effectively these are not invaders who came with the Arab invasion. Okay, now we have science. We know what happened. They are the people, of the land, and that makes a big difference because no propaganda can change a point.
Just a couple of questions on the domestic scene here. The Washington Post today said, no U.S. shift after Gaza aid deadline. Washington doesn't impose consequences, even as Israel has largely failed to meet its demands. That's the headline in the Washington Post. And Biden and Blinken seem incapable of enforcing 6 federal laws that are being violated, which establish conditions for shipping weapons to foreign countries that are not being met by the Israelis. What's your view on that?
So Israel has been behaving like a child with a strong personality and capable of winning concession from her or his parents continuously. So that's what has been happening. But the problem is not finding any resistance They kept going, and one day they realized that, they went too far, but it'll be too late. So you can rely on APAC, to do a bunch of things, but at some point, the strategy is not going to work.
We're talking with Nassim Taleb, author of the bestseller Black Swan, among many other publications. Domestically, Jewish Americans, like Jewish Voice for Peace, and If Not Now, are protesting more against the U.S. government backing the Israeli invasion, not just in Gaza, but in Lebanon itself, than the Lebanese American community in the United States. You saw the weak letter that Lebanese American people sent to Biden before the election. It was a disgrace. They didn't demand a ceasefire. They didn't demand anything. They just said, we support you. What's your view on that?
No, Ralph, depends on what you call Lebanese American people, because you have, of course, you have had a very active Israeli propaganda among Lebanese Americans and among Christian Lebanese, and then therefore there are a lot of movements. So I would not put too much on this, okay? But let me insist on one thing. You got to look at the long run, what is stable, not tactical errors. So if Israel wanted to be a stable state, not fragile state, it would achieve stability through genuine lack of threat from its neighbors. Now, the problem is they're in an opposite situation. The only reason they're there is because of force. No state ever in the history of mankind has survived just solely on the basis of force. Sparta is gone, and there's nothing left of it, okay? So nothing left to remind us of its power. So force in itself has never been sufficient. And we're in a situation today where it's just force that gives it its existence. Look at the states next to it. Egypt is visibly they have a puppet, they have a US-Israeli puppet. And even then, it's not, he may change his mind. Okay, so an artificial peace between Egypt and Israel. And the same thing with Jordan. So their strategy is not working. So in the long term, it's not a viable state because it relies solely on force.
There seems to be news that Netanyahu and his people want to annex the West Bank. If they annex the West Bank, it's a one-state solution. If they get equal rights, like in South Africa, voting rights to Palestinians and Israelis, do you favor a one-state solution or a two-state?
It doesn't make a difference in the long run, because if you have a one-state solution, it would be a Palestinian state. If I were Israeli, I'd go for a two-state solution. Because a one-state solution, you have what happened with the Christians in Lebanon, that the reason they left, like your ancestors or me, all right, is because it was very easy for Christians to go west because they had cousins overseas. They had the network already built overseas. Palestinians don't have that much, and Israeli Jews have that. So it's easier for them to emigrate. And, you can't really have a state, a mono, I would say, ethnic run state in a, when half the population is of the different faith, you see? So having a state with 7 million Muslims and 7 million Jews would probably lead to the decline in number of Jews over time because of emigration. And of course, Palestinians don't have a lot of places to go. Those who could go have left in the past since 1948. Or very few, who could leave, still. So basically, you're going to end up with a state that's going to be a Islamic majority state. So long run, what they think is a one-state solution is actually very much better for Palestinians.
Hannah?
I'd like to take a step back. The results of this election have a lot of wonky people who claim to know what they're talking about, tearing their hair out and claiming shock. You've written a lot about you've studied a lot about uncertainty and risk and fragility. Has our political system become too fragile? Can it not withstand
Yes.
predictable changes seem to set everyone running for cover?
There's one property of the system that we have, the political system in the United States, that it has democracy without governance, which is a problem. Congress doesn't represent the American people, so the election seems to be a formality. Because think about it, if AIPAC controls the House, I don't think it's the wish of the American taxpayer or the American voter to follow AIPAC's policies. But effectively, no matter who's elected, Democrat or Republican, AIPAC runs. And AIPAC is not the sole lobby. There are other lobbies. So I think the lobby system has weakened the governance of our system greatly. And people have an instinct of survival, but I think that lobbies interfere with that. And I think unless we do something to control lobbying groups, we're not going to do very well.
Well, we're out of time. Thank you. We've been talking with Nassim Taleb, a polymath, as one can call him, in many directions. And we hope that you'll continue your good work. Is there anything else you'd like to say?
Yes, I'm extremely honored to be with you today. And I really hope for peace, but I'm pessimistic about peace because the situation there gets worse every decade.
On that note, we have to conclude. Thank you, Nassim Taleb.
Thank you. Thanks.
We've been speaking with Nassim Nicholas Taleb. We will link to his work at ralphnaderradiohour.com. Up next, journalist Ryan Grimm stops by to give us his best guesses on what to expect from the incoming Trump administration. But first, let's check in with our corporate crime reporter, Russell Mokhiber.
From the National Press Building in Washington, D.C., this is your Corporate Crime Reporter Morning Minute for Friday, November 15, 2024. I'm Russell Mokhiber. A federal jury awarded $42 million to 3 former detainees of Iraq's notorious Abu Ghraib prison, holding a Virginia-based military contractor responsible for contributing to their torture and mistreatment 2 decades ago. That's according to a report from National Public Radio. The decision by the 8-person jury came after a different jury earlier this year couldn't agree on whether Reston, Virginia-based CACI should be held liable for the work of its civilian interrogators who worked alongside the U.S. Army at Abu Ghraib in 2003 and 2004. The jury awarded plaintiffs Suhail al-Shimari, Salah al-Ajali, and Assad al-Zubayr $3 million each in compensatory damage and $11 million each in punitive damages. For the Corporate Crime Reporter, I'm Russell Mokhiber.
Thank you, Russell. Welcome back to the Ralph Nader Radio Hour. I'm Steve Scrovan, along with David Feldman, Hannah, and Ralph. Unlike 8 years ago, Donald Trump seems a bit more organized as he prepares to assume power and make all of his dreams come true. Our next guest will give us his take on how likely he is to make those dreams a reality. David?
Ryan Grimm is co-founder of Dropsite News, the host of the podcast Deconstructed, and a co-host of the show Counterpoints. He was previously D.C. bureau chief for The Intercept and the Washington bureau chief for the Huffington Post, and he has been a staff reporter for Politico and the Washington City Paper. He's the author of the books This Is Your Country on Drugs, We've Got People, and The Squad, AOC, and the Hope of a Political Revolution. Welcome to the Ralph Nader Radio Hour, Ryan Grimm.
Hey, thanks for having me here.
Welcome, Ryan. Well, your new group with Jeremy Scahill and others are focusing, I'm sure, a laser beam on the incoming administration of Trump and his Trumpsters. And as you know from your experience, these are very aggressive. They think they're above the law. They are greedy. They want to turn the U.S. government into a honeypot for their commercial paymasters, which include their own businesses, by the way, like Elon Musk. And when that happens, when you have greed and almost total power, with the Supreme Court on your side, with the Congress under Republican control, you're inevitably going to get serious examples of corruption. You're inevitably going to get blatant corruption. I'd like your views on this because even though they're going to have their own nominated federal prosecutors, there are still state attorney generals and local prosecutors that are not under the thumb of the Trumpsters. How do you think this is going to work out as one of the few remaining avenues of accountability? You'll know there was corruption in the first Trump term, and a couple secretaries in his cabinet had to resign. Give us your view in terms of the possibility of slowing down this regime by going after its own self-inflicted corruption.
You know, that's certainly an avenue. So far, to a lot of people's great disappointment, Democrats have been pretty terrible at that. So on the one hand, they angered the entire, support base for Donald Trump and whipped them up into a frenzy, accusing Democrats of prosecuting their enemies, while at the same time not actually prosecuting them for any corruption. Going after a classified documents case, the case in New York about the hush money, there was some, which that wasn't like fundamental type of corruption that you're talking about now. The Georgia case where he was being accused of trying to overturn the election. That was much meatier, but a different kind of corruption. There was, an enormous amount of, Jared Kushner, for instance, created quite a target-rich environment and the same as with Mnuchin. As soon as Jared Kushner left the administration, he was cashing a $2 billion check from the sovereign wealth fund of Saudi Arabia. Just an absolutely shocking level of corruption. The fact that Democrats, even when they had the House of Representatives and the Senate, did not, they recently started poking around that from the Senate, but when they had the House for 2 years and did nothing about that. They had the opportunity to subpoena Kushner, to look into documents, to look into communications about what was Saudi Arabia actually buying with this $2 billion. We had reported over at The Intercept that bankers who had seen the pitch deck that Jared Kushner's firm had put together found it to be the most ridiculous, amateurish type of product that would be laughed out of a room where you were, pitching a small teachers union for a few $1,000,000. And they managed to turn this pitch deck into a $2 billion payday. So, why and for what? Now, because the Trump movement has been able to argue to its base that it feels persecuted, they are probably going to spend a significant amount of their energy going after those who they see as their persecutors. The Trump world has signaled that they're going to go after Fani Willis, that they're going to go after Jack Smith. And you wonder whether that has and this gets to your question, you wonder if that has a chilling effect on attorneys general who might, be looking at some of these criminal enterprises. Will they worry that they will be then wind up on the business end of some Department of Justice witch hunt?
Well, one avenue of corruption is definitely going to be pursued. They're going to get through Congress a cut in the IRS budget. They've been after that since 2011 with some success, which means that the IRS will have less resources to hire extremely sophisticated investigators, actuaries, accountants, and lawyers to go after these complex tax schemes that transcend national jurisdictions. And all this is going to increase the freedom of these corporations to engage in tax evasion, the freedom of the super wealthy that they're associated with to engage in tax evasion, not tax avoidance, tax evasion, which is illegal. You have views on that? Are you watching that one?
Yes. One of the immediate things they're going to do is try to stop the upgrades being done to the IRS. As you know, one of the problems the IRS has is that they have been consistently hamstrung when it comes to basically, upgrading their software and the computers that they use. They're relying on computers from the 1980s and 90s when tax collection is one of the key areas where advances in software development and even AI, algorithmic exploration of tax returns, should enable any government to be able to, very quickly check whether tax returns are on the up and up and to be able to flag ones that need further review. Because we're talking about very, straightforward products here that are coming from taxpayers. Their tax returns, the laws are out there, and the tax returns are in the computer system. They can be analyzed. And so the IRS is in the process of upgrading their system to get to a place where they can catch tax cheats who are making off with, hundreds of billions of dollars a year. And I think one of the first things you're going to see from the Trump administration is just a shutting down of that process and a firing of as many IRS workers as possible.
Well, I've called this election the greatest political disaster in American history. You're looking at the big picture as well as specific cases that you and your colleagues are investigating. Give us your overall view, what you think is coming, whether it's on climate change, on tax reform, on obstructing civil justice access by wrongfully injured people under tort law, on government contracts going out, contracting the U.S. government to corporations, on the role of Musk, on the whole issue of lack of preparedness for pandemics, as well as breaking the social safety net and smashing the rights of labor. Give us your views on this.
Yes, I think they're going to go after labor, I think, which will be something of a surprise to some of Trump's fans who've kind of convinced themselves that he is something different than he is. They want him to be kind of a populist who supports workers, the working class, and unions, and instead you're going to see him probably come in and eviscerate the NLRB and do everything in his power to make life miserable for unions. I think he will indeed take a hatchet to the federal workforce. And I think you're going to see thousands upon thousands of federal workers lose their jobs, leaving a lot of these agencies, utterly paralyzed. And I do think that he's going to try to do some type of spectacle of deportation. Like, I think it'll be very difficult for him to do the mass deportation that he has been promising. But I do think that because he's a person who appreciates the spectacle, he will get the military involved. He'll get ICE agents in the interior, and he'll give his base some serious images of either the military or ICE or both, smashing down doors and dragging people out. And he will revel in the controversy that creates. And you could have, you could see a knock-on uptick in attacks by vigilantes as a result of that. But I do think at some point he'll kind of hit the limits of what he's capable of with the federal government.
He'll continue freezing the federal minimum wage at $7.25. He'll block the child tax credit extension for 61 million children that cut poverty by 40% until the Republicans blocked it in January 2022. What do you think he's going to do on pardons? You think he'll actually pardon all the convicted, incarcerated felons associated with the January 6th insurrection?
That's a good question. I don't think he knows the answer to that. I think on the one hand, I think he wants to give that to his base. On the other hand, I think he's not quite sure how much he can get away with. So that's a live question, and it'll be interesting. It'll be an interesting gauge of how confident he is if he does go forward with that.
Well, you know as well as anybody, Ryan Grimm, that he is a lawless politician. He has said with Article 2, I can do whatever I want as president. That was in July 2019. Now he's bolstered by the Supreme Court decision and his clear victory in the Electoral College and in the popular vote. So what do you see as restraints? Who's going to restrain this man?
Well, time is one of his restraints, and incompetence is another. He's up against those two elements. And infighting, there are a number of competing factions for his attention and for his agenda, and they are going to relentlessly work to undermine each other. So that factor will restrain him. The Supreme Court, I think, is very happy to have him as president. They will gladly take some more Trump picks to replace Alito, to replace Clarence Thomas, who I suspect will both retire within the next 2 years, which will give Trump, 5 of the nominees on the court, at least. But I don't think the Supreme Court wants him sticking around for good. Like, the Supreme Court isn't interested in turning over its power to him. And the same is true of the military. He is going to work extremely hard to stack the military with as many loyalists as possible. But I think it's an open question as to whether or not there even are enough of those types of people who exist in the world to fill the positions that would be needed to take real control of the operational control of the military.
Well, it looks like there's going to be a purge of the military, so there are no more Mathis or Kellys or Espers anywhere near the top. He's hell-bent on that because he felt defied by the top military brass not bowing to his orders and basically hewing forth to the rule of law of civilian-military separation. You're skilled at drawing implications here. In 2016, 2020, and 2024, he's refused to release his medical records and medical history, even though he told reporters, yeah, I'm going to do it. Don't worry, I'm going to do it. And then the election day comes and he never does it. Now, we're talking medical records and medical history. What implications do you draw from that? That we may see a President Vance before the 4 years are up?
Maybe. It's hard to know because you can't underestimate his own vanity. If there's anything even modestly embarrassing to him in there for who knows what reason, you can imagine him wanting to cover that up. And so I really don't think you can read much into it. His body feels so well preserved by, Diet Coke and fast food that, perhaps he'll live 200 years, outlive all of us. He could croak today. It's really impossible to say. If it wasn't for the kind of orange coloring, mostly his orange coloring, I think he would look a lot more decrepit probably in public than he does currently look. So he's kind of able to mask his febrility. So to your point, we very much could see a President Vance before 2028. Certainly possible.
Before we go to Steve, give us your take on the Democratic Party debacle here in some granularity. They couldn't defeat the worst GOP in history. Openly anti-women, openly anti-labor, openly disregarding climate violence, openly for corporations über alles, openly against almost anything that should do a politician in, including lying constantly. And they lost. Give us your take on the Democratic Party. Any possibility of renewal here? Do you think there'll be any mass resignations by the Democratic Party apparatchiks, or just more syndicalism and more nepotism, and let's wait until the next election? There's no accountability here.
Yeah, I wouldn't wait for any resignations, but there certainly at least is a rethinking going on. You have all of these people now saying, oh boy, maybe Bernie was onto something when he was talking about the millionaires and the billionaires and the 1%. There's this clamoring out there for a Democratic Joe Rogan. We need to find a Democratic Joe Rogan, which is a stand-in for their Democrats' inability to reach men, for the most part, young men more generally, but which also stands in for their refusal to engage in the new independent media ecosystem, of which Rogan is a leading figure, but by no means the entire thing. And as I'm hearing them say this, I'm just reminded of the fact that in 2020, Democrats did have their own Joe Rogan, and his name was Joe Rogan, and he had endorsed Bernie Sanders in the presidential campaign, and has a broadly progressive and populist view of the world. The Bernie Sanders supporters were relentlessly slandered by Democrats as quote unquote Bernie bros. And now, 4 and 8 years later, the Democrats are left wondering, why don't any of these young men support us after they were fairly roughly driven out of the coalition? So I hope that there's some reckoning going on with that approach to half the population, but I'm not sure that there is.
A pretty stunning result when the candidate Kamala Harris got 10 million less votes than Joe Biden did in 2020, indicating one of the greatest stay-at-home revolts in American history. And Donald Trump listeners even won the new voter tally, the voters who voted for the first time, many of them young people reaching the age of 18. The Democrats couldn't even grab that constituency. Do you see any challenge to the Democratic Party, any grassroots revolt against it, any kind of Tea Party mobilization to take over, the way the Tea Party, which never had more than 300,000 members, had such a grip on the Republican Party and drove a couple speakers from office in the House of Representatives?
Nothing yet. And I think that there's some real fatigue. If you compare the reaction among Democrats 8 years ago to the reaction today, it's pretty starkly different. You can even see it just in the kind of ratings for MSNBC and CNN, which exploded in the wake of Trump's last victory, but are cratering now as people despair and get frustrated at what they see as their lack of options. There'll be a process of people work through, and it's right now it's not obvious at all where they go.
Ryan Grimm, just before we go to Steve, David, and Hannah for quick questions, tell us about your new group. You used to work with The Intercept, and you started a new group.
Yeah, Jeremy and I and a few others from The Intercept founded a new news organization called Dropsite News, which you can find us at dropsitenews.com. Go there to sign up and get our kind of free email updates, and we'll harass you every now and then to become a paying subscriber or donate to us. But the journalism is free, will always stay free, and it's supported by people who contribute to it. I think that's the model for independent media that works. The big tech companies have choked off any ability to make any money through kind of just the way that blogosphere funded itself in 2000s through like a random ad networks. And certainly we also wouldn't want to produce a business model that had us relying on corporate advertising either. So yeah, we're reader funded news outlet and breaking a lot of news, and hope we continue to.
For sure. Steve?
Yeah, Ryan, our previous guest, Nassim Taleb, said, think what you will about Trump, he doesn't like wars. What do you see on the horizon in the foreign policy sphere for Trump, Ukraine, Gaza?
So it's interesting. So far there have been some victories for, I think we need a name for this. I guess you could call them the anti-war wing of the Trump coalition, but that doesn't quite do it because they're confrontational when it comes to China. Even that wing is often pretty hawkish when it comes to Israel. So we need a better name than anti-war. Anti-neocon, perhaps, is a better way of thinking of it. They call themselves America First, rooting themselves in that kind of old Republican isolationism. That faction has had some victories. They blocked Mike Pompeo from coming back to the administration. Nikki Haley was blocked, but I think she kind of blocked herself by challenging Trump in the primary. But they've had some setbacks. Marco Rubio has been reported to be in line for Secretary of State. My sources in the Trump world say that despite a pretty furious kind of rearguard action to try to prevent that from becoming official, that it will become official. Mike Huckabee, who is a kind of maniacal, messianic Christian Zionist, has been named ambassador to Israel. Like, just kind of remarkable to have somebody with his views in that position. He believes in the full annexation of the West Bank. He believes, and he really does believe this entire, wild biblical idea that you need to build a third temple on Al-Aqsa and that'll usher in the apocalypse, and just bonkers stuff. And Pete Hegseth, who was just named Pentagon Secretary, is also a believer in that theory, although Hegseth has also become separate from that, rather strongly, apparently anti-war. So he might not even get through the Senate because he's going to run into a lot of opposition from kind of military-industrial complex here in Washington, D.C. Unclear if Trump cares if he gets confirmed. Maybe Trump just puts him in as acting and then tries to recess appoint him at some point. So far, the neocons are doing well when it comes to putting people in positions of power, which, cuts against a lot of Trump's campaigning. And certainly when it comes to Central and South America, it looks like the people that will be in positions of power are the most reactionary that maybe have ever been in those positions.
Thank you very much, Ryan Grimm, one of the reporters and founders of Drop Site News. Good luck to you and your investigations to give people the right to know.
Thanks, Ralph.
We've been speaking with Ryan Grimm. We will link to his work at ralphnaderradiohour.com. Now, before we wrap this program up, we welcome back our resident constitutional expert, Bruce Fein, to answer our questions about the state of the once and future president's legal troubles. David?
Bruce Fein is a constitutional scholar and an expert on international law. Mr. Fein was Associate Deputy Attorney General under Ronald Reagan, and he is the author of Constitutional Peril, The Life and Death Struggle for Our Constitution and Democracy, as well as American Empire Before the Fall. Welcome back to the Ralph Nader Radio Hour, Bruce Fein.
Thank you.
Welcome back, Bruce. Listeners, we're going to be very precise. Bruce is going to give his studied views on matters that Trump is now initiating, as well as a hangover from the Bibi Biden, Bibi Blinken regime. Bruce, let's start with the news that Trump doesn't want to wait for the Senate to confirm all his nominees. He wants recess appointments. In other words, he wants to violate the Constitution and get rid of advise and consent clause in the Constitution. Is he going to get away with it?
Yeah, and what's so remarkable, Ralph, is that the three Republican candidates, and I see that Mr. Thune from South Dakota was the one who prevailed today, but all three of them before that vote, Thune and John Cornyn and Rick Scott from Florida, all were eager, said, yeah, don't worry, we'll go into recess, and we'll get there faster than you. We don't want the confirmation power. You can appoint whatever scoundrels or corrupt rogues that you want to. We don't want to do any scrutiny. I mean, it's another example of our refrain that Congress and the Senate have turned into an ink blot. They don't care anymore.
Okay, what's the remedy? Is there a judicial remedy here, or is it a self-contained demolition of that provision of the Constitution, which our founders took very seriously?
Yeah, I do think there's a remedy here, and that is, I think that any of the decisions made by the people who are appointed through illegal or unconstitutional recess appointments, when they take any action, you wouldn't have to comply with their actions. You could say the decisions, their orders are null and void because they weren't appointed properly. I mean, that's how the initial recess appointments decisions called NLRB versus Noel Canning came about, where somebody who was a target of the NLRB successfully challenged the decision of the board to go forward with an unfair labor practice saying you don't have constitutionally appointed members. So there will be an ability to challenge these recess appointments, and I'm sure they will be taken up. This is not a case where we don't have standing.
Well, is there another affirmative judicial remedy if members of Congress, say Democrats, object to having Trump's nominee for Secretary of Defense or EPA or Homeland Security go right to work, bypassing the confirmation process, which can, by the way, result in their being defeated in a Senate vote? It's not automatic, as history teaches us. Is there any affirmative resort, such as an injunction, say, by Democratic members of Congress or anyone else around the country, or no one has standing? What's the story on a second affirmative remedy?
Well, it would be possible for the Senate, which remains in control of the Democrats until January of next year, the early part, they could seek what I would call a preliminary injunction. They could go to court right now because they can see the train coming down the track, right? And they say it's imminent that they're going to try these unconstitutional recess appointments. And because imminent harm is a reason for standing, and because the recess appointments then would remove the senator's ability to vote on the nominees after January 20th of 2025, but it would have to be the institution of the Senate. But the institution could bring the suit as long as they got a majority, which they do have, if everyone supported it. So that's an alternate route to achieving what would be the opportunity of someone who's actually injured by a decision made by someone who is appointed illegally under the recess clause.
How about a third remedy, Bruce Fein, regardless of its possibility of winning? But is there any inherent contempt power in Congress on bypassing the advice and consent provision of the U.S. Constitution, the way there is, as you have pointed out many times, an inherent congressional contempt power for executive branch officials defying a congressional subpoena?
Yeah, I think the more customary remedy would be impeachment and removal from office, disqualification from holding office in the future, because the contempt power, the U.S. Supreme Court said, is related to the informing quality of Congress. That is, they need to know information to decide whether to amend laws, whether they need new laws, whether to repeal old laws, whether they are confident that there's no mischief or lawlessness in the executive branch. Here, this isn't a question of information where you have a defiance of a subpoena where you're not yielding and surrendering, disclosing information Congress needs to do a duty. You're just bypassing a congressional prerogative. It would be like usurping the war clause, right? You go to war on your own. You don't have Congress declare war. It's what Biden is doing right now when he's sending soldiers to Israel to use in an attack on Iran, manning the THAAD missile defense system. So I think that third prong would more likely be impeachment and removal from office than contempt.
Let's go to the second topic. The press has got this one wrong. They're saying that the Supreme Court decision in June that protects the president from any criminal prosecution in his official duties also applies to state criminal prosecution cases. Well, on November 26th, the state judge is supposed to be sentencing in New York City Donald J. Trump after being convicted on 34 felony counts earlier this year by a jury. And this judge has the power now, under the state law, to send him to jail, to put him on probation, and or to fine him. Now, even the New York Times and people who should know better, like Charlie Savage, have said that the Supreme Court opinion applies to state cases. Your constitutional view?
I don't think it does. I mean, I believe that might have some power if the state crimes allegedly happened while the president is in the Oval Office, which didn't happen with Trump. The New York case arose out of Trump's activities as a candidate, in which he committed 34 felonies and altering business records to conceal payoff to his pornography star Stormy Daniels, which he thought could damage his campaign. He's not even president. He couldn't possibly claim that's a presidential act. And it was an action under state law. The trial was 6 weeks, 22 witnesses. The jury came back with a verdict, in like 2 hours, a record time. There is a very brief flirtation with a phone call made to Trump in the White House that lasted maybe 90 seconds. That couldn't possibly have been an influence on the jury's verdict, which came back after, again, 6.5 weeks and 22 witnesses, which means it's harmless error at best. But it's very clear that, unlike with regard to Jack Smith or his successor, Trump cannot order a state prosecutor to drop a state case, not constitutionally permitted.
And that applies to the Georgia criminal case against Trump, which is pending, subject to a Georgia Court of Appeals. It's been taking months to render a simple decision whether to affirm or overrule a lower Georgia court which allows the prosecutor to continue her case. Is that correct?
Yes, correct. And I would just add a footnote to that, Ralph. The U.S. Court of Appeals for the 11th Circuit yesterday, a very conservative judge appointed by Bush, held that Mark Meadows, his chief of staff, was not acting in a federal capacity. When he was a member on that, he was on that infamous phone call with Raffensperger saying you got to find the 11,700 votes. It could be criminal unless you find them someplace. That he was trying to remove his case into federal court, arguing, well, I was performing a federal function. U.S. Court of Appeals 11th Circuit said, you're not. This has nothing to do with running the federal government. It's totally a campaign issue. So that, I think, underscores even more that the Georgia state, however the Georgia people sort that out, it cannot be derailed under some kind of federal constitutional argument.
Well, we'll see if Donald Trump continues his spectacularly successful fugitive from justice that he started as a businessman and it continued as president of the United States. Nobody's come close to escape the arm of the law and the reach of the sheriff. And there's one last chance before he becomes president on January 20th at the state court in New York. And tell us the name of the judge.
Judge Merchant, Juan Merchant, and he did find during the trial Trump in contempt of his gag order, but imposed rather puny $10,000 fines. I do not think remember, he already had delayed the sentencing once under what I think is an absurd theory that somehow this one vagrant phone call into the White House that was part of the trial could have influenced the case. He should have just said, harmless error, I'm sentencing. This should have been months ago. So I'm not optimistic that he's going to have the strength and fortitude to do the right thing. The Trump lawyers have already said he should await sentencing until after Trump completes his second term, 2028. So that's where we are.
There you have it, listeners. Thank you very much, Bruce.
Thank you.
I want to thank our guests again, Nassim Nicholas Taleb, Ryan Grimm, and Bruce Fein. For those of you listening on the radio, that's our show. For you podcast listeners, stay tuned for some bonus material we call the Wrap-Up, featuring Francesco DeSantis with In Case You Haven't Heard. A transcript of this program will appear on the Ralph Nader Radio Hour Substack site soon after the episode is posted.
Join us next week on the Ralph Nader Radio Hour. Thank you, Ralph.
Thank you again, everybody.
Say you're tired of trying. You say we have no choice. Say you're just one person, and who will hear your voice?